9 lives offered, a hidden ritual. An actor who never imagined becoming a cog in a machine that, according to various sources, had been operating in silence for years. But after the initial revelations and the confusion they sparked on social media, a fundamental question arises. What mechanisms are really driving this crisis? To understand it, it is necessary to examine every detail, from the initial testimonies to the omissions, silences, and accusations that have accumulated. This analysis aims to unravel the layers surrounding the case of Yu Menglong, an interpreter whose sudden death was followed by a torrent of posts, speculations, and leaks that continue to spread across the digital sphere. Over the past few weeks, the public debate has been marked by the emergence of a user who claimed to be a close friend of Yu Menglong's family. That individual, through never-before-seen childhood photos of the actor and recent visits to his hometown, sought to demonstrate that he had genuine ties to the family environment. His statement not only contained direct accusations against 3 individuals who were allegedly present at the scene of the incident, but also warnings about the existence of a supposed esoteric ritual that would require the participation of 9 victims. According to this version, the actor would not have been the first or the last person involved. The post that sparked the discussion appeared on October 31st. In it, the alleged friend recounted that Yu Menglong's family was unable to communicate publicly because their social media accounts had been suspended. He claimed that censorship had limited the reach of any attempt to report the incident, while certain individuals, identified by name, had remained oblivious to the events, despite, according to his statement, having been present during the decisive hours. This claim rekindled pre-existing tensions between the digital community and perceptions of institutional conduct. The content also introduced 3 key names, Tong Yiren, Jiguang Guang, and Xiaomai Qi, whom the publication attributed with a direct presence at the scene. In parallel, alleged activities related to medical networks and corporate properties linked to Jiguang Guang's circle were mentioned, as well as death records that some users interpreted as elements requiring further investigation. The public reaction was immediate. Platforms of all kinds began to replicate the information, while other users urged caution, demanded verifiable evidence, or pointed out the possibility of deliberate disinformation. This phenomenon was amplified by claims that numerous anonymous profiles, allegedly linked to distraction campaigns, were intervening to alter the prevailing narrative. From this point on, the analysis requires a meticulous and objective evaluation of the available elements. The statements, silences, deleted posts, and cross-accusations form a complex web that needs to be organized to provide a clear picture. In the following sections, we will delve into the origins of the conflict, the media reactions, the crisis management by those involved, and the possible long-term repercussions in order to understand why this case has generated such commotion and what its future evolution might be. From the very first moment the post by the alleged family friend of Yu Menglong appeared in the early hours of October 31st, the tone of the discussion was defined by the combination of 3 essential elements: institutional silence, digital censorship, and the presence of 3 figures directly named in the statement. The trigger was not only the actor's unexpected death, but also the perception that the family had been left voiceless, unable to publicly explain what had happened. This perception began to shape the emotional and media framework that would later broaden international attention to the case. The origin of the conflict lies in a simple yet extremely sensitive fact: the claim that Yu Menglong was the victim of an incident at a residence linked to Jiguang Guang, a person with family and business ties who, according to various online sources, may have influenced the subsequent development of the public narrative. The family's silence, explained by the alleged suspension of their social media accounts, provided the perfect vacuum for other voices to occupy the discursive space. Among those voices, the alleged friend's voice took on an unexpected prominence. The shared photographs, one of the actor as a child with his mother, and another from a recent visit to his hometown, became pieces intended to demonstrate authenticity. In an environment of uncertainty, any visual element acquires symbolic value. Here, the images served as an emotional anchor. They were traces of a time when the actor's life was tied to family intimacy, not to public controversies. The key element that sparked attention was the claim that 3 individuals, Tong Yiren, Jiguang Guang, and Xiaomai Qi, had been present the night the incident took place. It wasn't a direct accusation in legal terms, but rather a narrative presented as an observation by someone close to the family. The testimony stated that these 3 individuals had acted as if nothing had happened, maintaining their public lives without any perceptible changes. This contrast between the perceived gravity of the incident and the apparent normalcy of those mentioned reinforced the general unease. The conflict also took on another dimension when the author of the post mentioned an alleged esoteric ritual that would require 9 participants. According to this theory, the actor's death would not be an isolated event, but part of a broader set of practices attributed to groups with access to power and influence. This reference to the mystical, the ritualistic, and the occult did not appear as a conclusive assertion, but rather as an interpretation conveyed by sources linked to the feng shui tradition and ancestral practices. However, in the context of social media, such elements tend to be amplified rapidly, producing divergent interpretations that blend symbolic analysis with narrative speculation. At the same time, the figure of Zhiguang, identified as the owner of the residence where the incident allegedly occurred, became the focus of deeper scrutiny due to information linked to his business activities. According to widely circulated online data, his name is associated with corporate structures in the medical sector, with significant shareholdings in healthcare institutions and pharmaceutical supply chains. The existence of prior reports mentioning irregular procedures in these settings fueled the perception that the situation required a more thorough investigation. On the other hand, references to Tong Yiren's behavior before and after the day of the incident opened up a new front of debate. His lack of social media updates after October 24th was interpreted by some users as an additional indication that something significant was happening. Other voices, however, considered that the lack of activity did not constitute sufficient evidence to establish a direct connection to the case. Likewise, the role of Xiaomai Qi, recognized for his presence in the videos captured at the scene, sparked prolonged discussions. The image of someone wearing dark glasses in a nighttime setting, with a figure reflected in their lenses, became a constant subject of analysis among internet users who sought patterns or clues that would allow them to identify those present. The fundamental point at this stage of the analysis is to recognize that the origin of the conflict cannot be explained by a single factor, but rather by the convergence of several elements: the family's lack of communication, the emergence of unverified testimonies, the identification of figures with high public exposure, and the inclusion of symbolic elements that evoke occult traditions. All of these factors combined created fertile ground for the case to spread. The key question for the viewer, and a direct invitation to participate in the collective analysis, emerges here. How do you interpret this convergence of silences, accusations, and symbols? Comment Amen if you want us to continue with the unfinished stories. When the initial post went viral, the ensuing communication phenomenon was immediate and multifaceted. Within hours, national and international platforms began reproducing the most striking excerpts from the testimony. This process not only amplified the original content, but also fragmented it into multiple parallel interpretations, each driven by distinct digital communities. The media avalanche was not characterized by the uniform dissemination of a single discourse, but by the simultaneous expansion of narratives that contradicted, reinforced, or complemented one another, depending on the group that replicated them. The initial impact can be measured by the exponential increase in mentions of Yu Menglong's name, as well as by the emergence of discussion threads that meticulously analyzed every available piece of visual or textual information. Faced with the absence of official statements, the public began to construct a collective interpretation based on fragments, hypotheses, and comments. This behavior is typical of situations in which an information vacuum leaves room for social imagination. The division of the discourse was structured along 3 main lines. The first line was made up of those who considered the alleged friend's testimony a legitimate warning. For this group, the elements presented, perceived censorship, the absence of official statements, and the presence of identified figures, created a pattern of behavior that required vigilance. The second group consisted of users who adopted a skeptical stance. For them, the lack of independent verification and the presence of symbolic theories related to traditional rituals suggested that the narrative should be treated with caution. This group was calling for institutional corroboration and transparency in the investigation. The third line reflected an intermediate position: users who didn't rule out any possibility but felt that the discussion was being accelerated by the intervention of anonymous profiles. The suspicion that there were organized campaigns to manipulate public perception, whether to amplify or neutralize the case, became one of the recurring themes in the conversation. The reaction of the tech platforms also became the subject of analysis. The removal or suspension of accounts associated with the actor's family sparked a debate about content control mechanisms, especially in contexts where information has a strong social impact. Some users interpreted these actions as standard protocol. Others saw them as signs of deeper restrictions. As the case gained attention, documents about the corporate structure associated with Zhiguang began to circulate. These materials described chains of companies, ownership percentages, and ties to medical institutions. In parallel, mentions emerged of a doctor named Lashua Yu, whose prior reports on irregular surgical practices at medical centers linked to the Jiguangguang business group added a new level of concern. Reports of the doctor's sudden death and the deaths of 3 graduate students in the days that followed sparked an additional wave of concern. The media frenzy reached its peak when lists attributed to Tong Yiren's computer began circulating, allegedly related to services and death records. Although these documents could not be verified, their mere appearance helped reinforce the perception that the case transcended the boundaries of an isolated incident. What's remarkable about this phase isn't just the speed at which information spread, but the way narratives evolved based on user interaction. Each comment, visual analysis, video clip, or screenshot was integrated into a collective construction that, although not always aligned with verifiable facts, reflected the magnitude of public interest. The phenomenon also highlighted the role of digital disinformation. Comments mentioning distraction operations or coordinated campaigns added complexity to the analysis. The presence of newly created profiles exhibiting repetitive behavior or identical messages contributed to the perception that there were actors attempting to influence the development of the discourse. The media avalanche, therefore, not only amplified the original narrative, but also transformed it into a mosaic of interpretations and reactions that, to this day, continue to expand with each new publication. In circumstances where the public narrative unfolds at an accelerated pace, the crisis management of those involved becomes a crucial indicator. In the case at hand, the response of the aforementioned figures, Tong Yiren, Jiguangguang, and Xiaomai Qi, was characterized primarily by silence, the absence of statements, and the continuation of their activities without any reference to the incident. This strategic choice had a significant impact on public perception. Tong Yiren's case stands out due to the abrupt halt in his social media activity after October 24th. Previously, his digital presence featured frequent posts related to personal projects and activities. The sudden absence of updates generated conflicting interpretations. For some, it constituted an indirect indication that something significant was happening. For others, the pause could not be considered evidence of involvement or knowledge of the events. Xiaomaiqi's figure faced a different kind of scrutiny. His presence in videos captured near the scene of the incident, identifiable by his wearing dark glasses at night, made him the subject of visual analysis by users. This phenomenon, common on digital platforms, leads to the reinterpretation of gestures, movements, and reflections in lenses or objects. While such observations rarely constitute conclusive evidence, they contribute to the creation of narratives that affect public reputation. For his part, Jiguangguang's position was complicated by the business connections attributed to his name. In situations where there is a pre-existing corporate network that has been the subject of controversy, any new development tends to be interpreted as part of a pattern. In this case, previous reports of medical irregularities attributed to institutions linked to the sector in which Jiguangguang is involved added an additional layer of complexity. The death of Dr. La Shuayu and 3 students, days later, helped reinforce the idea that the case contained elements requiring further investigation. From a technical perspective, crisis management is evaluated based on 3 parameters: response time, message clarity, and consistency of actions. In the 3 cases analyzed, response time was non-existent, message clarity was replaced by silence, and consistency was reflected only in the absence of official statements. Silence, in highly active media contexts, can be interpreted in various ways. In some scenarios, it is considered a strategy to avoid amplifying rumors or unverified information. In others, it is understood as a lack of transparency or a sign that there is information someone does not want to reveal. In this case, the absence of messages was interpreted differently depending on each user's prior stance. The alleged friend of Yu Menglong's family added another element to the crisis management. He claimed he would reveal new information progressively. This statement transformed the case into an episodic narrative, where each future post was anticipated as part of a larger sequence. The promise of new revelations generated both anticipation and skepticism, once again dividing the audience. The platforms also played an indirect role in this phase. The suspension of accounts associated with the actor's family was interpreted as an obstacle to direct communication. This intensified the perception that the narrative was dominated by external actors rather than by those directly affected. Crisis management, in this case, did not originate with the main stakeholders, but with third parties. This is significant because it demonstrates that when the central actors fail to communicate, others fill that void, partially defining the public narrative. The lack of an official response from the parties mentioned allowed external voices, users, analysts, commentators, and the alleged friend, to become the primary sources of discourse, resulting in a proliferation of divergent interpretations. The final phase of the analysis requires considering how the case might evolve in the near future. The long term consequences depend not only on the veracity of each piece of information disseminated, but also on the cumulative impact that the narrative has already had on public perception. First, the reputations of the individuals mentioned have been tarnished by their association with the case, regardless of whether any official conclusions have been reached. In the contemporary digital environment, public perception forms quickly but dissipates slowly. This means that even if clarifying statements are issued in the future, collective memory may continue to associate these individuals with the elements of the case. Secondly, the case has demonstrated how digital dynamics transform any event into a narrative event. The emergence of lists, reports, videos, symbolic theories, and testimonies generates a constant flow of information that shapes collective interpretation. This feature is essential for understanding that even if the case stabilizes, the narrative can continue to evolve due to new analyses, reinterpretations, or user posts. Third, the alleged link between business activities and irregular medical practices constitutes an area that could be subject to external investigation. In particular, the deaths of Lashuai Yu and the students associated with him raise questions that could be reopened in the future if new sources or documents emerge. Finally, the symbolic dimension of the case, especially the theory of the ritual involving 9 individuals, could continue to circulate in communities specializing in esoteric analysis, regardless of the factual developments. This component, although not verifiable from an empirical standpoint, helps keep interest alive by appealing to long-standing cultural imaginaries. The case of Yu Menglong therefore remains in a transitional state, where the lack of official information coexists with multiple digital interpretations. Its evolution will depend on the emergence of new statements, institutional investigations, or publications by external figures that influence the prevailing narrative. Looking back at the entire trajectory of this case, it becomes clear that the narrative surrounding Yu Menglong did not unfold as an isolated event, but as a complex process built on silences, fragments, and multiple interpretations that emerged in a rapidly expanding digital environment. It wasn't just a sudden incident, but the cumulative effect of the absence of official information, the emergence of unverified testimonies, and the overlay of symbolic theories that added additional dimensions to the public debate. The essence of this crisis lies in the coexistence of uncertainty, expectation, and speculation, as well as in the emotional impact it had on those who followed the sequence of events. The resulting damage to communication cannot be underestimated. The reputation of the individuals mentioned was deeply affected, even in the absence of institutional statements or conclusions. The suspension of accounts associated with the actor's family, the lack of verifiable responses, and the proliferation of online analyses contributed to solidifying a narrative that, to this day, continues to expand. Each element, from childhood photographs to corporate reports and ritual interpretations, was integrated into a discursive structure that shaped public perception in an intense and sustained manner. This case reveals a universal lesson. In the age of hyperconnectivity, any information vacuum becomes a space where multiple voices compete to define the meaning of events. The absence of official communication does not halt the narrative's progress. On the contrary, it allows external actors, anonymous users, commentators, and purported insiders to assume a leading role and transform the discourse into a collective construction. Likewise, the coexistence of data, rumors, and symbols demonstrates that public opinion does not strictly distinguish between categories of information when emotional urgency outweighs analytical rigor. From a broader perspective, this case underscores the importance of transparent communication policies, especially in contexts involving public figures. Crisis management, when non-existent or insufficient, amplifies uncertainty and opens the door to interpretations that can persist beyond any future clarification. The narrative that is constructed in the present shapes the collective memory of the future, as happens in all crises with high social impact. Looking ahead, the possible developments in the case depend on factors that are still undefined. The emergence of new, verifiable information, official statements, institutional investigations, or additional records that provide clarity. However, even in the absence of these elements, the story has already been inscribed in the digital ecosystem as an example of how an event can transform into a cultural phenomenon through the constant interaction of thousands of users. Ultimately, the story surrounding Yu Menglong reminds us that public truth is not a static object, but a dynamic construct influenced by diverse voices, multiple interests, and digital amplification mechanisms. In a scenario where verified facts coexist with symbolic and speculative interpretations, Clarity can only emerge through a deliberate effort of critical analysis and the pursuit of objective information. Meanwhile, the narrative will continue to evolve, reformulate itself, and generate new questions among those who seek to fully understand what happened.